You still check. That is the part you would never say out loud to anyone, and it is the part that tells you the most about where you actually are. You check the phone before you are fully awake, in the 2 or 3 seconds before you remember there is no reason to. You drive a route that takes 4 minutes longer because it passes something. You rehearse a conversation in the shower that will not happen, and in the rehearsal you are calm and finally understood. And then the water shuts off, and you are standing in a bathroom, in a life where nothing has been explained to anyone. Something left. A person, a job, a version of the future you had already spent years living inside of. The strangest part is not the grief. The strangest part is that some part of you is still moving toward it, still reaching upward for something already out of reach. And no amount of understanding that it is gone has been enough to make the reaching stop. You call this being unable to let go. You call it obsession, weakness, a lack of self-respect. On the harder nights you call it proof that something in you is broken because everyone else seems able to close doors and you cannot close this one. But there is a much older name for what is happening to you, and it comes from a tradition that spent centuries watching this exact behavior happen inside glass, under low fire. What you are experiencing is not a failure of will. It is a law of matter. It has a direction, and almost nobody chasing right now has ever been told that the reaching itself is the one thing capable of ruining what is left. Look at the specific shape of it, because the shape matters more than the story. You are not grieving in one continuous piece. You are grieving in short bursts interrupted by activity, and the activity is always a form of pursuit. You search for information you do not need, an updated photo, a location, a detail about their week, and every piece of it helps for 90 seconds and costs the whole evening. You explain the situation to friends who have already heard it, and you notice you are not looking for advice, you are looking for permission to keep it open a little longer. Underneath all that motion is a fact you keep walking around instead of through. Whatever left has already changed state. It has not been in the room for some time. The alchemists who worked before chemistry existed built their craft on that one observation, and they built it in glass so they could watch it happen. Put raw matter under sustained low heat inside a sealed vessel, and it does not stay one thing. It divides. Part of it lifts, turns to vapor, and climbs the neck of the alembic on its own, requiring no help and permitting no interference. Part of it stays at the bottom, heavier, darker, unable to rise no matter how long the fire burns. They called the part that lifted the volatile, from volare to fly, and the part that stayed the fixed, from figere to hold fast. And the first rule of the craft, written into manuscript after manuscript across 500 years, was this: the volatile rises by its own nature, on its own timing, and the operator who reaches into the vessel to bring it back down destroys the work. What looks to you like losing someone, the tradition would have named instantly as separation separatio, the first true operation of the great work. And what looks to you like loyalty, like love that refuses to quit, they would have recognized just as fast and with far less romance. A hand pushed up into the neck of the vessel, grabbing at rising vapor, disturbing the one process that was finally underway. Before this goes further, name it. There is a single word that locates where you are more accurately than any paragraph you could type, and the word is rising. If you recognized yourself in the checking, in the 4-minute detour, in the message written and not sent, put the word rising in the comments below, exactly as it is. Nothing added. Not the story. Not the name of the person. Just the word. Because the story is the chase, and we are about to take the chase apart. And if this map is new to you tonight, subscribe before the next section, because what follows is the mechanism itself, in 4 movements. It is worth naming all 4 before walking through them, because the middle of this is much more survivable when you know the shape of the road. First comes exhalatio, the breathing out, the moment something in your life changes state and lifts. Second comes persecutio vaporis, the pursuit of the vapor, where nearly everyone becomes trapped, sometimes for years. Third comes separatio vera, the true separation, where the line between what left and what stayed becomes visible. And fourth comes fixatio, the fixing, where what could never evaporate hardens into something you can stand on. None of the four can be skipped. The second is where the work usually stops, and it stops there so quietly that most people never notice they stopped at all. The first movement is exhalatio, the breathing out. In the laboratory, this was the moment the operator first saw motion in the glass. A thin, pale column lifting off the surface of the matter, so faint at the start that an untrained apprentice would miss it, then unmistakable. Nothing had been stolen. The heat had simply reached the temperature at which one part of the substance could no longer remain bound to the other, and that part did what its nature required. It rose. The alchemists were careful with the language here, because the language shaped what the operator did next. They never said the vessel lost the volatile, they said the volatile ascended. Psychologically, this is the hour or the week when something in your life crosses the temperature it could not survive. A relationship reaches the heat at which it can no longer hold its shape. A role you have carried for years stops being possible to carry. Someone tells you the truth, or stops telling you anything, and you feel the change of state happen in your body before your mind has produced a single coherent sentence about it. What has left is not only the person or the position. What has left is the entire future you were quietly building on top of it, the one that lived in you as a set of assumptions so ordinary you never noticed you were making them. You know you are inside this movement by a particular disorientation. Ordinary objects become unreliable. A mug, a text thread, a Sunday morning, each carrying a weight that has nothing to do with the object. You go to tell someone something and remember halfway through the impulse that the telling no longer has a destination. There is a lurch in it, physical, low in the chest, repeating at random for weeks, the reaching, then the absence, then the correction. The danger of this movement is the interpretation you make in the first days, because that interpretation will govern the next year of your life. Almost everyone reads the lift as theft. Something was taken from me, and the natural response to a theft is pursuit, is recovery, is getting back what was mine. Read that way. Every instinct that follows is organized around retrieval, and retrieval is precisely the operation the tradition forbids. Read the other way, as assent as one part of a substance doing what its nature required at a temperature it could not survive. The instincts organize around something else entirely. The difference is not semantic. It decides whether you spend this year in the vessel or with your hand jammed up the neck of it. What is required to cross this movement is neither acceptance nor understanding, both of which arrive later and cannot be forced. It is only that you stop calling it theft while you have no evidence that it was. You are allowed to be devastated. You are not required at this stage to be at peace or generous or wise about any of it. You are only asked to withhold the one word that would send you into the second movement. The second movement is persecutio vaporis, the pursuit of the vapor, and this is where the work stops for most people who begin it. In the laboratory, the failure was common enough to be described across multiple traditions. The apprentice, watching the volatile climb the glass, would panic at the sight of the substance appearing to leave, break the seal, and reach in to force the vapor back down. Three things happened, always in the same order. The vapor did not come back because vapor cannot be held by a hand. The air entering through the broken seal cooled the vessel, and the fire's work had to begin again. And worst, the disturbance dropped soot back into the residue at the bottom, contaminating the one part of the substance that had actually stayed. He had lost the volatile anyway, and ruined the fixed as well. Read that again as a description of your last several months. The chase does not return the person, because a person who has changed state is not retrievable by effort, and effort is the only tool the chase has. The chase cools everything. Your work goes flat, your friendships thin out. The temperature of your whole life drops, while all available heat goes into one closed loop. And the contamination is the part almost nobody names, honestly. Every hour spent reaching upward is an hour in which the part of you that did not leave, the part still here, still capable, still yours, gets covered in something that does not belong to it. Resentment, self-contempt. A story about your own worth assembled entirely out of one person's decision. The signs that you are standing inside this movement are specific and easy to verify. You have a rehearsed speech, a version of events refined over weeks, and some part of you believes that if it were ever delivered correctly, the outcome would change. You have a checking ritual you would not describe accurately to a friend. You measure your days by whether contact happened. You keep the question open by force, because a question that stays open is a vessel that stays broken, and while the vessel is broken, you never have to look at what is at the bottom of it. Carl Gustav Jung described the mechanism underneath this with a precision that has not been improved on since. He called it projection. What we carry in ourselves and cannot yet recognize as ours, we experience as living inside another person, our own capacity for tenderness, our own authority, our own permission to be at ease in a room. The other person is real, and their qualities are real, but a portion of what we felt in their presence was our own material, seen at a distance, wearing their face. This is why the loss is disproportionate to the facts. You are missing access to parts of yourself that had been living outside you, in their custody, without either of you agreeing to the arrangement. And this is why the chase feels like survival rather than choice. You are not reaching for them. You are reaching for what you believe only exists where they are. The danger of this movement is that it can be sustained almost indefinitely without ever looking like a crisis. Pursuit is respectable. It is easy to narrate as devotion, as depth of feeling, as being someone who loves hard. Marie-Louise von Franz, who spent decades on this material, wrote about how much the ego prefers a torment it can act inside to a stillness it cannot control. And the chase is exactly that, a place where you always have something to do. Years disappear this way. Not in agony, in activity. What is required to cross this movement is one act, smaller and less dramatic than everything the chase has trained you to expect. Withdraw the hand, not the feeling which you do not control, and not the memory which you should not want to. The hand, the checking, the detour, the message drafted and reread, the search performed at midnight. You do not need to want to stop, and you do not need to feel resolved. The alchemists asked nothing about the operator's inner state here. They asked only that the vessel be left closed, and they were unromantic about the reason. The volatile rises either way. The only variable is whether you also lose what stayed. The third movement is separatio vera, the true separation, and it is the first one that requires no effort from you at all, which is why it is almost never recognized while it is happening. In the laboratory, this was the stage where, with the vessel undisturbed and the heat steady, the division inside the glass became complete and visible. Above, the volatile, gathered at the neck, entirely distinct. Below, the fixed, settled, dense, unmistakably its own substance. Gerhard Dorn, whose writings Carl Gustav Jung read closely for exactly this reason, described this division as the operation that made all real knowledge possible, because until the two are apart, you cannot examine either one. Mixed, they had looked like a single thing. That is the illusion the fire exists to end. Psychologically, this is the season when you can finally see which parts of that life were yours and which were on loan. It arrives quietly, usually in an ordinary moment. You are cooking or walking somewhere, and a thought lands with no drama attached. That was never mine. Or its harder twin, that was always mine, and I gave it away without noticing. The steadiness you felt around that person turns out to have been partly your own steadiness, activated in their presence, still available. Nothing about the other person needs to be diminished for this to be true. They can have been genuinely good, genuinely loved, genuinely irreplaceable as themselves, and it is still the case that some of what you thought left with them never left at all. You will know you are in this movement by a strange new accuracy. The story you had refined for months starts to sound slightly false in your own mouth, not because it was a lie, but because it was one substance where there were always two. You catch yourself remembering something exactly as it was, without editing it upward into what you wished it had been, or downward into a case for the prosecution. Whole days pass in which the question of contact does not come up, and noticing that afterward registers less as progress than as a room being quieter than you remembered rooms being. The danger here is subtle enough to reverse the whole thing. Clarity feels so much like strength that people mistake it for readiness and reopen the vessel. You see the situation cleanly for the first time in months, and cleanliness produces confidence, and confidence produces a message, well-written, honest, unusually free of blame, sent at 11 at night. The vessel cools, the soot comes down, and the work restarts at the beginning, this time with the added weight of knowing better. The mirror error does the same damage, using new clarity as a weapon, converting separation into a verdict, building an identity out of having been wronged. What is required to cross this movement is patience of an unusually dull kind, letting the separation stand without doing anything with it, no message, no verdict, no final conversation to make the understanding official. Understanding does not need to be witnessed by the person it concerns in order to be real. That is the entire lesson of the sealed vessel, and it is the one that costs the most. The fourth movement is fixatio, the fixing, and it concerns what is at the bottom of the glass. When the volatile has fully ascended, what remains is not an empty vessel. It is residue, heavy, dark, dense, unimpressive, and completely incapable of evaporating. The alchemists prized it above almost anything else in the laboratory because it was the only material in their possession proven by fire to be unable to leave. Paracelsus, who trained as both physician and alchemist, was blunt about it. The fixed body is the only foundation on which anything durable can be built, and you never know what is fixed in a substance until heat has taken away everything that was not. This is what you have not looked at yet. Because the chase has kept your eyes pointed upward for months, there is a portion of you that did not go anywhere. It did not leave when they left. It did not evaporate when the role ended or the future dissolved. It is the part that got up in the worst week and did the minimum. The part that kept one promise to someone who would never know it had been hard. The capacity for attention, for craft, for care that was never contingent on being returned. It is not glamorous, and it will feel when you first turn toward it like almost nothing, like grey powder at the bottom of a jar. That reaction is documented. Every operator who reached this stage recorded the same disappointment on first sight of the residue. You will recognize this movement by an odd narrowing. Your life gets smaller and unexpectedly heavier in a way that feels stable rather than depressed. You stop being interested in explaining yourself. Advice stops landing because you are not looking for interpretation anymore. You are looking at what is actually here. You find yourself doing very ordinary things with a completeness that surprises you. A meal cooked properly for one person, a piece of work finished on a day nobody was watching. The danger of this movement is mistaking the residue for a verdict. Some people, arriving at the bottom of the vessel, decide that this unimpressive material is the final truth about them, that the ash is who they always were, and the rest was borrowed. That reading stops the great work exactly where it becomes possible. Terra damnata, the condemned earth, was the alchemist's own name for this residue, and they used the word condemned with full irony. It looked like waste, it was named like waste, and every operation that ever produced anything of value in that tradition was built on it. What is required to cross this movement is only that you handle the residue as material rather than as sentence. Not a conclusion about your worth, an inventory of what fire could not take. There is a part of this the four movements do not prepare you for, and it deserves to be said without softening, because it is where almost everyone turns back. It is the specific loneliness of not chasing. Nobody warns you about it because from the outside it looks like recovery. You withdraw the hand, you stop the checking, you leave the vessel closed, and instead of relief what arrives is a silence with a texture you have never encountered before. There is a stretch of time somewhere after midnight where the absence stops being an event and becomes simply the condition of the room. And in that stretch, the mind offers you, with real generosity, the exact memory that will hurt most, presented as evidence you should reconsider. You will find yourself with the phone in your hand and no memory of having picked it up. You will feel, on the worst of these nights, that you have lost twice, first the person and then the last thing that still connected you to them, which was the reaching itself. Understand what is actually happening there, because the interpretation is everything. The chase was not only pain, it was occupation, and it was the last remaining structure in which the whole thing still existed in the present tense. Stopping it is not the removal of a symptom. It is a second loss, real, and nothing in the tradition pretends otherwise. What you feel on those nights is not evidence that you were wrong to close the vessel. It is the sensation the fire produces at exactly this point, described in the same terms by people who had no contact with each other across centuries, and it is documented that consistently because it is the standard experience of the operation, not a sign of malfunction. Something else happens down there too, and it is harder to admit. Underneath the missing, if you sit in it long enough without acting, there is often something that has nothing to do with the other person at all. A much older ache, familiar in a way that predates them by decades, the sense of having been left before, in some room you were much younger in. This is where the disproportion comes from. The recent loss opened onto an earlier one, and the chase was, in part, an attempt to resolve the earlier one by winning the recent one back. Jung called what lives down there the shadow, the part of us we do not carry consciously, and therefore keep meeting in the outside world, wearing other people's faces. Meeting it directly, once, without a chase to hide inside of, is the whole reason this stage exists. This is where most people abandon the work, and not because they are weak. They abandon it because the darkness and the stillness arrive together, and that combination feels like proof that something has gone wrong, that a healthier person would not be sitting alone with this at 3 in the morning doing nothing about it. You are not required to feel good about this stage, to be doing it correctly. You are only required to leave the vessel closed while it happens. Something opened in the last several minutes that a video cannot close for you. You now have a name for what you have been calling weakness, and you can probably locate, more precisely than you could an hour ago, which of the 4 movements you are standing in. The lift you are still reading as theft, the pursuit you have been narrating as devotion, the separation you keep interrupting with one more message, or the residue you have not yet turned around to look at. This is not random, and it never was. This has a structure mapped and remapped for centuries by people watching the same law operate in glass. Most people go through it blindly, with no vocabulary for any of it, and without a map, people stay stuck exactly where you might be stuck right now, calling the second movement love and losing years inside it. Understanding the structure of what is rising will always matter more than reacting to the pain of the rise. This channel exists to keep drawing that map, one operation at a time, and continuing to watch is not a favor to whoever made this. It is the next step of the process you started the moment you recognized yourself in the checking. Put it plainly in the comments. The word rising, if you have not already, or which of the 4 movements you found yourself inside tonight. Comments and subscriptions are what sustain this work right now. And staying subscribed is simply staying near the map instead of walking back into the dark without coordinates. What comes after fixatio is the part of the tradition almost nobody hears about, and it is not the part you are hoping for. The alchemists had a name for what happens to the volatile once it has fully risen, and the operator has kept his hands out of the glass. They called it sublimatio, the lifting. Vapor that ascends undisturbed and cools at its own pace does not vanish. It condenses higher in the vessel into something purer than the substance it came out of, and then, on its own timing, it descends, not into the hand that grabbed for it, into the vessel itself. Be exact about what this means, because it would be dishonest to hear it as a promise that the person comes back. It is not that, and the tradition is not making that claim on any timeline. What descends is not the person. What descends is what was yours the whole time and had been living outside you in their custody, the tenderness you only felt in their presence, the ease you thought was a property of that particular room, the authority you only had when someone else was witnessing it. That material rose when they left because it had been bound to them. Left alone, it purifies, and it comes back down into the only vessel it was ever going to be usable in, which is you. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection, and he was clear that it is the least comfortable and most consequential movement in the whole process of individuation, the long work of becoming a whole person rather than a well-arranged set of borrowed parts. What that looks like in practice is quieter than the language suggests. The relationship you have with the missing changes before the missing goes away. It stops being an emergency and starts being information, something you can notice, arriving, name, and continue eating dinner through. The patterns become visible before they execute instead of afterward. You catch the hand moving toward the phone while it is still moving, which is the first real freedom this process offers, and it does not feel like triumph. Alchemy never promised anyone happiness at the end of an operation. It promised wholeness, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more durable, a life assembled out of what fire could not remove. The self that emerges is not an improved version of the one who was left. It is not more impressive or more composed. It is denser, harder to evaporate, and much harder to lose because it is no longer keeping essential parts of itself in someone else's house. Go back to the morning we started in, the 2 or 3 seconds before you remember. Nothing about tomorrow has to be different. You may check again, and if you do, that is not the failure of everything. It is one hand entering one vessel one more time, and the vessel can be closed again within the hour. What has already lifted is not coming back down into your hand, and the reaching was never keeping it near you. It was only keeping you from looking at what is at the bottom of the glass. Turn around at some point and look at the residue. It is heavier than it appears. It is entirely yours, and it never left. That is the whole law, and what the tradition says happens after this is the next part of the map, still being drawn here whenever you are ready to keep walking it.